and welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. We're going to be talking about something that is actually kind of personal, but perhaps you have a story similar to ours, because we were talking just the other day, Benway and myself, we were talking about, what was that transition between children's books and children's stories and adult literature. And what were the books that we went through? And of course, it's unique for every person if you think about it. There's no one quote-unquote gateway drug, if you will, that will take you from children's books to adult books. And we started talking about that. And it was actually a fascinating subject. And so we figured we'd do an episode about it. So Dr. Benway, how's it going? And what do you think of this topic, by the way?
Oh, I hate it whatsoever. How dare you bring this up? No, I'm kidding, of course. I thought I'd just take a little bit of the thunder out of your sails to mix my metaphor. It's interesting to me because it's a complicated question for me. I've been reading since as far as I can remember, and I was very big on collecting all sorts of books, and I liked books on tape as a kid. But I think the question you're really trying to get to is, when did I start? My attitude toward reading adult fiction now, it didn't start all the way back then, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it was a process whereby I said, okay, this activity of reading adult fiction is worthwhile because, I've done it. I had read, earlier, stuff that didn't stick, but there was a process by which I transitioned into where I'm at now. And it took several years of transitioning to get to this point. And so I don't know if that was the same with you.
Well, here's the thing that I've realized, that the medium of written literature, of written stories, right, for me has served different purposes at different points in my life. It's evolved. I'm talking about the entertainment factor. I'm not talking about when you're reading something like a school book or a college textbook or something, when you're learning information. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when you appreciate writing. It's gone through different stages. And also my appreciation or my thinking about reading has changed also to the degree that I've earned a living off of what I've written. And so a lot of times I read a lot of books that I read not because I particularly cared for them, but because I was interested in seeing how the books approached certain problems and dealt with certain problems. And so, like when I was a kid, I was interested in the story. And so my first books were Danny Dunn books. Danny Dunn was, my hero. For those of you who don't know, Danny Dunn was this redheaded boy who lived in this very nice suburb. And he had what I realized retrospectively was kind of like an odd domestic situation. But anyway, he lived there and his friends were Irene and Joe. And Joe was like this poet, like dreamy-eyed guy. And Irene was more like Danny Dunn, very scientific and mathematical, and they got into all kinds of adventures. I mean, they were basically the same trio as Harry Potter, to tell you the truth. And anyway, the story of Danny Dunn, it was multiple stories, and there were like a bunch of them. And I think that the first paperback I read was Danny Dunn, Invisible Boy. And it was a full-length novel. It was 150 odd pages, I would think. And I read it when I was, I think about 10 or 11. 10 or 11, I think. And I got into that. I got hooked into Danny Dunn. And I read all of the books. And I still remember a lot of them. And then from there, I graduated to reading books by the same authors. And that's how I started like creeping across the literary landscape from that humble beginning. Because before that, I'd never really paid attention to what I was reading. It was not something important. But I don't quite know how I latched onto Danny Dunn. I've forgotten. But that was the book I remember, Danny Dunn, Invisible Boy. And because it was a story that he found this little dragonfly. That it was actually a mechanical dragonfly. It was so small, and it had like a little camera and a little microphone, so you could fly over anywhere and just light there, and control it. And you had like a helmet on. I mean, it was science fiction for 1970s. I mean, actually, this technology, I realize now as I'm telling it to you, it could probably be conceivable today. So Danny Dunn would fly the little dragonfly over. It was basically a drone, and just light it there. unnoticed, and he could hear what other people were talking about and watch what they were doing. And so he was like the invisible boy, and it was a lot of fun. And yeah, that's what started me reading. What about you? What were the books that you like the first ones?
Well, again, it's a very hard thing because I just had books coming toward me constantly, and many, like you said, trying to get out of the children's period. I mean, I had many fits and starts through like early youth slash kind of late youth,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, going into my teens, but things that would never stick. So, I tried reading and still have the same copy of C.S. Lewis's, Narnia stories, and it wasn't particularly interesting
No,
then,
yeah.
and it's not interesting now still,
Mm-hmm.
despite his Christian background.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was just like a series of like other things that I would start reading. Like I had started reading Poe and whatnot, but all of that stuff, it was like, yeah, it was interesting, but it wasn't what I would say inducive of the type of reading I constantly do now. That process actually started in school, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, and there was a very serious transition I experienced, which I think was a byproduct of me being potentially the last generation that might get this,
Mm-hmm.
which was I had become in contact with teachers who still had the traditional attitudes of reading and teaching English literature.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was younger, when they would force you to read various stories.
Right.
It was always the very predictable stories in which they were predictably, and this I think continues to this day because I was a little kid in the '90s. They would give these stories that were utterly unmemorable, other than the fact that they were written by a minority or by someone whose
Oh yeah.
identity apparently mattered. And I just vaguely remember that being part of the stories.
Yeah, I was
And
before that.
and
I was
then
before
and
that.
then
I
yeah,
missed that whole thing. Thank goodness I missed that whole thing.
yeah. So I get into in junior high, I get into a woman who was one of my English teachers, clearly like in her late 50s, if not approaching her 60s. And she was like very adamant, like, no, no, we're reading Great Expectations. And she started a process which later on in high school I had a similar teacher who was like, okay, we're going to read X amount of pages a day and I'm going to quiz you on it, and I'm not going to ask broad topics like, oh,
What's the
what was
themes?
Pip doing this day. It's like, what was the color of brick
Mm,
on the wall in this one scene.
right.
That's the level of paying attention you had to do. Well, by virtue of doing that and forcing you to pay attention, you actually are engaging the book more significantly.
Yeah.
And then, funny enough, when that was junior high school, when we went into high school, and I had a similar, still one of the best teachers I ever had. He was Dutch Indonesian, but was very strict on English, and he only cared to teach books that he thought were good. So he had no interest and no patience for representative authors and care about that matter. He just didn't give a shit, and he was also very strict on the use of language. So when he says using there instead of having to force he says, no, the language dictates he, you're going to use he, I don't care what your gender is. So I always appreciated that. But then he did the same thing in terms of teaching the books, and he actually noticed those of us who came from this particular high school with this particular teacher did better than the others, and he just kind of continued to cater to that. And so we continued on with those books, and I was glad that we didn't do the easy stuff that you could have done. So, for example, the first book we really went deep into was Tess of the D'Urbervilles,
Mm-hmm.
which
That's a good
is
book.
a Hardy, Thomas Hardy book, which is interesting because it's not the typical Victorian
Yeah.
book that you would get, which is
Mm-hmm.
approaching light entertainment. No, Tess of the D'Urbervilles is a very serious sort of proto-existential book, as
Yeah,
are many of his books.
but wait, just a little quick parenthesis. Isn't Tessa d'Urberville's before Madame Bovary? Because it's essentially the same topic.
I believe Tess of the D'Urberville was written after Thomas Hardy was writing at the end of the 19th, early 20th century.
Okay. No, sorry for that. I was just vaguely curious
Yeah.
about it. But yeah, I mean, but you see, didn't it happen to you? Because this happened to me, that my tastes evolved because at first I read to find the story, and it was only later, much later, actually in my 20s, that I started paying attention to the actual writing. And I remember quite clearly it was with Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. That was the book that first started like consciously paying attention, or perhaps it was a point that I realized that I was reading for the pleasure of the prose. You see what I'm saying?
Well, to continue the story, that was one of the books that was in the sequence of this with this teacher of mine, Portrait of the Artist.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I'll tell you, the collective response about it is that it was the least liked book universally in the class,
Mm-hmm.
because they felt the writing was fairly impenetrable and not worth the effort ultimately. So to your question about when did I start transitioning out of the story into noticing the art, in other words, what you're also kind of implying in that question is, when did I get out of the traditionalist mindset and into a modernist mindset, because that's fundamentally what one of the
Fair
manifestations
enough.
of that
Fair
is.
enough. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And my response to that is, it already was there.
Okay.
I knew very well that books were written by a human,
Mm-hmm.
and noted that, and it was usually through these, in particular through this class, because it forced that issue, because the structure of the writing became the subject of the class just as much as the story was.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a big element, and I think to me the reason why I asked, what did I get out of the traditional to the modern mindset, and I think the book that nailed it even more than Portrait of the Artist, which, like I said, didn't really sync well with the class,
Mm-hmm.
was Invisible Man.
Mm-hmm.
Invisible Man, for those of you who don't know, it was written in the early 50s by Ralph Ellison, black American writer, probably the best book by an African American writer, and they're not very many, I must
Go Tell It
admit.
on the Mountain
Uh,
is
and
has its moments.
and but I think it's not only one of the best by an African American; it's probably one of the best books post-war period.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
do think it's that good. And what's interesting about that one is that's clearly a book with a not just an existential point of view, but it's from you could tell that the author, Ralph Ellison, is putting commentary of himself into it, even though this is a fictional character. And so that really got me into because that's the latest book chronologically in terms of when it was written that we read.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started saying I want more like this, and that's when I started getting into more of his contemporary authors. And what really helped get that into gear, and I think others will probably have a similar experience, was that I had a friend who was similarly minded. In fact, he's still my best friend.
Mm-hmm.
We still talk about literature. And kind of how we got into that is by virtue of Ellison and trying to read a little bit more on what people say, would be worthwhile books to read. We both got into Harold Bloom's Western canon.
Mm-hmm.
And what we both liked about that was that in that book, I mean, the book does have a list of what Harold Bloom thinks are the books throughout the history of Western civilization worth reading. But more importantly, that's a whole book dedicated to saying everything you're going to be taught in college or contemporary attitudes towards literary criticism is bullshit. It's politically debased, and no one actually gives a shit about literature. Here's what you should here's what I recommend you should think. And so from there, we all, or my friend and I, went really deep into the likes of Philip Roth, Don DeLillo, Cormac McCarthy, Thomas Pynchon, and Norman Mailer. And I remember both of us near the end of high school regularly going to bookstores and trying to track down a bunch of these things and just reading through passages in the, be it in the car in our houses late at night. This was the kind of coolness we had. And I think the only time it ever came close to being like a little clique of people who enjoyed this was when, ironically enough, a crowd gathered around the idea of really liking Hunter Thompson,
Mm-hmm.
largely because everybody during my senior year really got into Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the movie.
Mm-hmm.
It was it's because a lot of the girls like Johnny Depp.
Sure.
But out of that
That's
emerged a little coterie of those of us who were interested in reading Hunter Thompson. And from there, kind of we expanded beyond that. Like I said, we were already interested in the likes of Norman Mailer. We expanded it to Tom Wolfe, and kind of the rest was history at that point.
Yeah, what happened to me was different. What happened was that I read because I was bored in school, and I would sit in class and sort of like tune in a little bit, and then just read whatever I was reading. And I just galloped through all kinds of pulp fiction. Because what happened after the Danny Dunn books, I remember the first adult book that was clearly adult, that was targeted for adults, that I read was The Bourne Identity when it came out in 1980, I believe. And the Bourne Identity, it was like, wow, this is like a grown up book. And from there, I started reading a lot more Robert Ludlum, and I liked the the action packedness, if you will, of his books. I could tell that it wasn't very well written, but at the time, I didn't really care. I just cared about the story. I cared about galloping from event to event. And I started becoming very critical of Robert Ludlum's books because I thought, oh, this stuff is unreal. It's unrealistic. It couldn't happen because a lot of things sounded just bizarre. And I remember one of the books that I enjoyed so much. I must have been like 13 years old. Was I read Princess Daisy, this horrible pulp fiction novel by Judith Krantz that sold for an enormous amount of money at the time. It sold for $1 million back in 1979 or whenever it was published. And I read it, and it had like adult sex scenes and shit, right? And so, of course, I'm 13 years old, perfect, right? I got into that, and it's not that I got into smut. What started happening was I started reading these adult books, in a vague quest to find out what's going to happen in the story, and also, are there going to be more sex scenes? And what happened is that, see, I basically went through all of the books that my mom would get on this book club. She was like literary club or book of the month club, something like that. I forget what it's called. Literary Guild. And she'd get like these books, and she was just a very fast reader, right? And so she just read, just to pass the time, and she preferred reading to television. But she wasn't not that she was an unsophisticated reader. She just didn't really care about higher literature. She could read it, but she didn't really enjoy it. She just preferred a good romp, right? In whatever it was, so, just a good story. She liked middle-brow entertainment, okay? And so I read a lot of middle-brow entertainment. And I read like all of Stephen King. I read all of James Clavell. These big doorstop novels that were really incredibly fast to read. And so it gave me a sense of confidence about length. And by the way, I think that one of the great things that J.K. Rowling's did for young people is it made them unafraid of a big book. Because all of the kids or young people today, or people under the age of 30, they're used to reading a 700-page book because, Harry Potter books were 700 pages. And I think that that's a good thing. But anyway, I got through.
That's like saying I like a cake with a lot of yeast in it because it has the big empty air, and I think I'm eating a big piece of cake.
No, come on. You got to give the devil her due, okay? Yeah, Harry Potter is not a great novel by any stretch of the imagination, but it made kids read. Okay, a lot of kids graduated from J.K. Rowling to much more and better literature because of her. There's nothing wrong with that.
Album liner notes help kids read.
Instructions
to their stereo helps them read.
No, you're being snobbish.
I am, because one needs to be snobbish.
Yeah, I agree. But like with a 12-year-old who doesn't read, and he discovers Harry Potter, and he gallops through all 7 books. What do you think that kid is going to do after that? He's going to go off and
read another stupid book. Read another stupid book.
No, he's going to go and find
look at how the numbers of sales go. They go to Twilight. That's where they go.
Well, yeah, I can't really. Yeah, but.
Yeah,
a minority. Okay, there is some element of that group that go on and read better books, right? Oh, come on.
What's interesting to me is if you had mentioned you got into pulp, and I didn't. Even
it's
at the time, I knew whatever. Even at the time, I'm like, this is just not worth the effort. When I got into pulp, it was around about way through reverse engineering, and it's not traditional pulp. Mm-hmm. By reverse engineering, I think what happens to a lot of folks when you find an author or a book you like, you'll then read kind of peripherally around it, critiques, commentary. And what you'll find is people saying, well, I kind of was inspired by this author, that author. And if you're curious, you tend to go back and see who those authors were and read a little bit about them. For me, I wound up getting into pulp really the old-fashioned guys, and it was through some of the more mystery-laden or heavily kind of atmospheric language-based novels that I was reading that I went back and heard people say, this is kind of like Raymond Chandler-esque
Right.
or
Right.
or Dashiell Hammett-esque, and that's what gets you into the likes of the Philip Marlowe novels, The Long Goodbye, The Big Sleep, things like that.
Yeah,
And
but
and with Dashiell Hammett, it's I think it's he wrote The Maltese Falcon, but I
yeah,
could be
yeah,
wrong.
Dashiell Hammett with the Maltese Falcon. Yeah. The process for me was I went from middlebrow potboilers into science fiction. And in the science fiction novels, I read Dune, I read The Forever War, and what have you. And then I got into Ursula Le Guin. And from Ursula Le Guin, actually didn't read many books by her. But I understood that she was like a more serious writer. I read The Lathe of Heaven, which had a big impact
Right.
on me when I was like 13, because I thought it was an incredible book. And here was the key issue that I'm kind of surprised, because as a 13-year-old reading The Lathe of Heaven, I love the book. I love the concept. I love how it was written. But when it got to the end, I finished the book and I said, she didn't know how to end the book. And it was a writer's instinct, okay? And it's actually a critique of that book that I would make today. She didn't know how to end the book. There's nothing wrong. Lots of great artists write great or make great art that just does not have an ending. Narrative art, of course. Like, for instance, Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now has a big old mess of an ending. It's still a compelling movie. The Lathe of Heaven, the same. It has a big old mess of an ending, but it's still a compelling book. But what happened was that with Lathe of Heaven, I started graduating over to more serious literature. And like you, I started reading criticism. And they were talking. I remember reading Paul Gray in Time magazine. Time magazine for me had a big impact because I was living in Chile as a teenager, starting around age 15. And my cultural bridge to the United States was Time magazine because we had a subscription. And so I'd read the Time magazine and I'd read the book reviews. And they would talk about books that were, of course, on the shelves in the United States, but not in Chile at the time. And of course, there was no Amazon or any way to get them. And Paul Gray would be referencing authors and people that I had no idea. I remember very clearly first hearing about this mysterious Thomas Pynchon character in Paul Gray's reviews of other books. And these names started accumulating. And so I started looking for them in Santiago in Chile. And of course, they weren't in the local bookstore because the local bookstore had books in Spanish, of course. And so what I wound up doing was going to used English language bookstores, which were very, very few in Chile at the time, and still, frankly. And that's where I started finding all of these books. And of course, since it was a used bookstore, the books arrived at random. You never knew what you were going to get. So every weekend I'd go and pick up 2-3 books and read them during the week. And they were sort of at random. It wasn't systematic. And for instance, I remember getting into Saul Bellow because there was this very nice hardcover edition of Humboldt's Gift that had landed there. I'd never even heard of Saul Bellow, but the lady there, a lady called Lorraine, she was this very old lady, rather infirm. She said, "Oh, he's a very important writer. You should read him," right? And I asked her, what has he written specifically? And I realized that she hadn't actually read him. And so she said, "Oh, he's just supposed to be important. He won the Nobel Prize. He must be important." And so, fine, I bought it and I read the book without having any idea who he was. And so that kind of randomness for me, I actually think it was a benefit because I started paying attention not to what people were saying, but because, the books just happened to pop into my used bookstore, the used bookstore that I would frequent. You know what I mean? That was my literary education. Mm-hmm.
Well, there's at least 3 key things I think for me were very essential in kind of developing this interest, potentially more, but the 3 key ones were, one, to have a co-conspirator or friend who was very much interested in the same way, because the act of talking about these with someone was very helpful in kind of expanding, you should think about this, think about that, and also just sharing frankly sharing like the passages that you like, as stupid as that sounds. But I remember very clearly us like sharing, particularly the passages we thought were just hysterically funny,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly the acid wit of a lot of guys we liked. I think the next big piece is, like I already said, was the criticism about it, because it was through the criticism or the reviews or however you kind of consume this that you're getting a sense of the historic knowledge of connections. It isn't even so like, oh, so and so is the pinnacle of this modernism. That would come later. And not to say it's uninteresting, but it was more like the reviewers who said, oh, this is what's really cool here is that he's taken something that this author did, but he couldn't get it right and kind of worked it out. And it's much more interesting that way. And so that, again, it builds the connections that are necessary to continue to expand this organically. I think the third thing, which you had mentioned, which I didn't, but is also very key, and it kind of ties in everything, is having a good kind of destination or used bookstore. Amazon is useful, but it's not the same.
No.
Going into a bookstore and just randomly, especially used bookstores, which have a tendency of being, shall we say, barely organized.
Yeah,
I think that's generous.
Yeah,
barely organized bookstore, and again, usually going with a friend, because I never really got the same thing when I was going with just my lonesome self. You go in, randomly go around, and like each of you are going to pull books for random reasons, either an unknown author, an interesting cover, some of the blurbs on the back. You may be interested in a section of the books. It doesn't really matter, but that kind of communal presence of the library, for what it is, essentially a bookstore is a version of the library, is very essential for that, because the physical presence of the connections are there. And it's why I always very stress that I can't morally get around accepting an e-reader. I get it. It's efficient, because apparently that's the key goal of all our lives, is just be very efficient when we travel.
Yeah.
But I don't really care, because the presence of the books in a physical form really mattered to me, and that's what kind of made this work. And even as a little kid, I remember I would go to the library almost every week, just by virtue of being in there. And even if I didn't check anything out, I just pull all sorts of random things I was looking at, kind of rifle through them. Some I'd take, some I wouldn't, but they were there. And I think that's, you add all those three together, you're going to facilitate something that I don't think American schools are very good at, which is facilitating autodidacticism when it comes to literature. I think autodidacticism is a goal that should be there anyway. And by that, autodidacticism simply means is the ability to be self-taught. Now, I am not really a big fan of the ideas of like, homeschooling and, I don't need a teacher to guide me. You kind of do. And the presence of other people helps, but you have to have a goal of saying, reach a certain point, you say, you know what, I'm interested in pursuing this, regardless of if someone forces me to. I may ask someone what they know or get some knowledge, from them, but I have to have a desire to continue to do this. And I think what tends to happen in schools, why I also brought up, Mike's teaching, is that there was a point when I realized, you actually can get good teachers selecting good books to get you interested in this. Whereas I think what a lot of kids read, like I said, they get that representation shit, which the goal is clearly not to find the best work. The goal is to make certain people feel good.
Yeah.
That my book is being talked about. When you have that mentality, reading becomes a chore, and it never latches on, and it never will. And in that context, you convince yourself that reading Harry Potter is an achievement.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, it's not.
Well, I mean, no. I mean, the representational stuff I despise. Okay, I mean, I just really do. My thinking about it's I've always looked at books divorced from everything else, even critical consensus. I just pay attention to the book itself. I pay attention to the work itself. I've always been extremely independent about authorities' opinion about something, because I have realized in my own direct experience that authority is so often very, very wrong. And so I just prefer to make up my own mind about something as opposed to getting it. Now, of course, there are myriad pieces of information on the world. And so it's impossible to, read them all, see them all, understand them all. So lots of times, for the majority of things, I take the expert's word on it. For instance, to give a trivial example, scientists claim that, the air that we breathe is, I think 23% oxygen and 50 something percent nitrogen or something words to the effect. Okay. It's not pure oxygen. Okay, I'll take their word for it. I don't know, and I'm not going to spend my time that. And that kind of thing, I'll let the experts decide. But insofar as literature or film, I'll keep my own counsel. And I think that stood me very well. And my own counsel has always been divorced from the author in the sense of, I don't care who he was. It's interesting. It's interesting perhaps to know a little bit about the biography of an author, because it might allow you to understand why exactly they wrote the fiction that they did. But then a lot of times, the best fiction, the best literature, it doesn't add anything or subtract anything to be ignorant of the author. Witness Shakespeare. I mean, we don't really know much about Shakespeare. And no, I don't believe any of these conspiracy theory bullshit that, for the very simple reason that other people, other authors at that time, there is as little, if not less, information about them. And so the amount of information about Shakespeare is on par with any other person, any other notable person at that time. Okay? I mean, shit, there are some kings and queens in medieval Europe that people don't even know the color of their eyes and hair, for crying out loud, because at that time people weren't interested in that kind of minutia, the personal minutia. So I don't buy that. But anyway, the point about Shakespeare, nobody knows who he was. I'm perfectly fine with that. I can enjoy all of his plays being completely ignorant of him. I don't quite see the issue of cheerleading somebody by virtue of who they are as opposed to the work that they created. And if you're cheerleading somebody based on their identity, then you're not really doing it because of the work. You're doing it because of your own, frankly, your own insecurities. That's what's driving you to identify somebody or praise somebody based on their identity and not their work, But yeah, sorry for going in that.
That's because that's pretty much the sentiment of the new criticism attitude toward a lot of things, which I actually adopted as well. Which for the new criticism reading, and I could be getting it wrong in my oversimplification. The idea was to say, yes, you can take all the historical context, the author's biography, you can throw all that in. The reality is you shouldn't do that. It's the text, reading it closely and seeing how it works. You don't really need to know beyond that. And, the likes of T.S. Eliot and others were really big on this idea. To me, that I think that's still power for the course, which is, it doesn't really matter. That being said, the older I get, the less doctrinarian I am with things. And yeah, I am kind of interested in the biography of certain authors because they're interesting. And the reality is, sometimes it's the biography of the author that leads you to the work. Ironically enough, you'll especially for me, and the thing I also can't deny is, be it either movies or even just interviews on television. Like when you were like me, if you were in college, I would go through out of boredom, but also intellectual curiosity, episodes from like Charlie Rose's show before everybody, realized that Charlie Rose liked the ladies.
Mm-hmm.
And he's one of the few people who would have on contemporary authors just talking about their work. So I would just cycle through them. And some guys came across as interesting and other guys didn't. And those that came across interesting, I would occasionally say, I wonder what they've read. And, this is how I would get into Tom Stoppard. This is how I got into Martin Amis and, cycle down the list of all of the other contemporary authors you could have conceivably gotten into. And that works. I mean, sometimes you reverse engineer these things. And the reality I have is that, look, yes, I love to say my critical faculties are objectively just my own, and that's it. But the reality is that we live in a society and there are other people, and we kind of have others act as our guide to help us through.
Yeah.
And you do need a guide for these things.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with it.
I like I said, what happened was that I was an indifferent student in high school. I was extremely good at math, And retrospectively, I realized that I had like real talent at math, but my parents didn't recognize it. And my school was it emphasized academics, but it was more like a school that emphasized being an all-arounder. And so
Hmm.
I didn't realize, and my teachers didn't realize the depth of my talent at math. Because, like, for instance, I never studied for math, and I never even paid attention to the math class. I just show up to the test and sort of like deduce and infer what we were doing and figure it out. I remember like desperately doing an exam on logarithms, and I hadn't paid any attention because I'd been reading. That's what I did in school. I read all the time, and I'd been reading something else, and I had this logarithm test, and I figured it out, and there was like this intuitive leap that I made, and I said, oh, it has to be like this, and I got it right, and I was the only guy in my class who'd gotten it right, but I hadn't even studied for it. So I realized I'm humble bragging, so I'm not gonna let me cut that out right now. But the point I'm trying to make is that, see, when I was growing up, I didn't unfortunately have the kind of guidance insofar as what to read, and so I read everything, and I read everything because I was bored. Because at that time, when I was growing up in the '80s, there were no VCRs. I mean, there was VCR, but you couldn't rent movies. There wasn't any other entertainment, and my mind was hungry for something to fill it up,
Right.
And school was just boring. And what happened, of course, was that there was a combination of not enough demands were being made on my attention insofar as school, and and so it was just like it was just I needed to feed it, and so I just ate everything insofar as books are concerned. And in that indiscriminate feeding frenzy, right, I read a lot of garbage and a lot of stuff that was really good. And because of it, I realized that a lot of times garbage can have very, very valuable things. And I realized also that a lot of times the books that are quote unquote classics can be just garbage. I mean, like, for instance, I read Henry James, and he bored me silly. And people kept talking about him, talking and talking and talking about him. And finally, I just gritted my teeth and read a couple of his books. What the fuck would I read? I don't even remember. I hated him. I thought he was just
Well,
overrated
I'm sure you
bullshitter.
probably read Turn of the Screw, which would have been the most exciting thing that
No, no, no. I didn't read Turn of the
of his or
Screw.
whatever.
I think I had Portrait of a
Well,
Lady.
that was your mistake.
Portrait of a Lady,
That
I
was your
think.
mistake.
Yeah,
That was definitely your mistake.
well, yeah, I mean, well, that's what happens when you're an autodidact, all right?
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you brought up something good there, and I think this is it's hard to not talk about schooling in this discussion because I think they're related.
Oh, yeah.
I agree with Gore Vidal that there's this, especially in American schools. I don't know the rest of the world, but there is this horrific conspiracy going on to make the two most interesting subjects you could conceivably be exposed to the most boring subjects in school, namely history and literature.
Yeah.
You have to be a mad genius to make both of these boring, and yet all of
They
our
succeed.
elementary through high schools to continue to succeed. It's the one thing they constantly do.
Yeah.
Is to make it boring. I mean, and to me, these were the things that I would history I got into in and of myself much younger, and then eventually getting into literature on my own. But the school just doesn't help on that matter. And I remember, I got to the point in high school when we were doing, our honors and AP, history classes. It was to the point where, I mean, I was, just doing very well on the test, but the subjects in and of themselves, I already knew, just based on what the history books were teaching. And I was talking to the teacher or myself, like, just to make it interesting for myself, I was saying, well, half of this is just comes from this particular school of interpretation. And these guys were biased as fuck. They were all part of the thing we're talking about. And they're trying to justify themselves. Why not this reading or that reading, just to spice it up. Because that's kind of the level you kind of get in college and maybe even late high school. You start realizing that. But yeah, the school is just like even I remember this is going back to fourth grade. Even.
Mm-hmm.
I knew this was there. I remember in fourth grade when they brought up, the Civil War. Their attitude on teaching fourth graders about the Civil War was that it was about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And even at that time, I said, well, you do know there were other matters here. I mean, they had a whole different notion of how the country should govern itself. And I remember the line I was given was the book says slavery. The answer to the question is slavery in terms of the cause. Please sit down and stop talking.
I guess they put you in your place, didn't they? Oh man, that's just depressing.
I didn't give a shit about school up until more or less high school, when I realized they said, oh, you got to get into a good college. Okay, so I worked to do that, became valedictorian as a result. That's how much I kind of cared. I mean, but that also tells you the degree to which the school system doesn't care. And that's the challenge, I think, that you have to overcome, or at least a lot of kids are going to have to overcome in order to get into these things.
Mm-hmm.
Because a few things are kind of going against you. One, like I said, the grand conspiracy against making these things interesting, which long American tradition of that.
Yeah.
But more importantly, there's going to be another wrinkle, because all of the books we've been talking about, certainly the ones I listed, outside of Wuthering Heights, which is written by a Bronte female,
Mm-hmm.
or Invisible Man, which is written by a black man, they're written by people who, are shamefully white, male, and dead.
Right.
And I think there will be a conspiracy to keep you from ever encountering these unmodified.
Yeah.
So you're going to have extreme boredom. Like, for example, I'm sure everybody here remembers all the controversy that always ensues whenever the idea of reading Huck Finn comes up, because the use of the word nigger Jim,
Mm-hmm.
or the phrase nigger Jim. Jim's a character. And they say, oh, that's so offensive. Not to mention that the fucking book, whole purpose of the fucking book
It's
was
anti-slavery.
to argue,
Yeah.
anti-slavery, and to argue for the humanity of this man called nigger Jim. No, we have to clear that out. So that's the environment you're living in. You're creating every single obstacle to prevent you from experiencing the pleasure of reading these books, which was the fucking purpose to write them in the first place.
Yeah, well, look, what we're basically seeing here is literal cultural Marxism, thinking in these terms. What did Marxism, or communism as it was implemented, what was it striving towards? That there would be no rich people. And anybody who had more than 2 cows, they would take away the cows, right? And so everybody would be equal. Everybody would be poured down instead of lifted up, right? The rich would be knocked down. And well, you're having the same thing insofar as culture is concerned. That which is good and graceful and interesting and erudite, no, that's knocked down. And what's elevated is quote unquote diversity. And diversity of what? Of skin color? Isn't that kind of racist? It is racist. Because you're basically saying that just by virtue of their skin color, their work is better. But it's not. You have a lot of these, like the Ta-Nehisi, whatever the fuck his name is, the guy Coates.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yeah, that cocksucker.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
I started reading his book. It's a piece of shit. The book that has gotten him all kinds of praise, it's garbage. Ralph Ellison would be just, he must be rolling in his grave, because Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin, they actually wrote well. I mean, you can agree with them or not, or think this or that, the other. They were good writers. This bullshit, it was awful. And this guy Coates is being lionized for it, just by virtue of him being a black man. Or Junot Diaz. Junot Diaz, right? He's like this Dominican guy.
Is it pronounced Juno or Juanito?
I don't
or
give a shit. He's really
know.
Juanito. That's what his real name is. Juanito Diaz. That's what his probably fucking name is. He just came up with this Juno thing just to be interesting. I mean, it's like the Hispanic equivalent of LaQuisha. It's just pathetic.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, and here's the thing. I already, like I said, when I'm going through this education, I got.
Oh, wait. Sorry.
I got
to YouTube and SoundCloud censors. I'm Hispanic, so I can say whatever the fuck I want about Junot Diaz. Okay. Sorry about that. Just wanted to clarify. But you were saying, Benway?
Well, anyway, here's the thing. I had already gone through this education, if you will, of not just being taught these more classic books, but then getting into my own interest of some of these older writers who are already, frankly, they were still alive when I was reading them, but they all started dying soon thereafter. So by the time I get to your Juanito Diaz or your, what the fuck is his name? Jonathan Franzen or what have you, already have the more established background. So when I'm reading them, I know how slight they are, and I know why we're kind of reading them, not for the literary talent. And you can't kind of pull a fast one on me. But I think for others, it's easier to pull a fast one on them because they don't really have the exposure to, frankly, the structure of writing a good story, or even know why people were writing what they were writing in the first place.
Yeah.
And like I said, it just feels like a conspiracy. And as to whether it's funny in the Soviet Union, right? So the Soviet Union didn't necessarily have multiculturalism as its vision. In the Soviet period, their big literary thing was socialist realism.
Right.
By that, I mean, it was the best way to paraphrase that. I think Martin Amis had the great line, which is, it's just, novels about love beneath the tractor,
Yeah.
which is to say, it's like all about men fighting the good fight for socialism, and then, in the roughness of work, but then they're all happy because they're going towards socialism. It was dead and dying. And what excited people in the East more than anything else were the wild stories of just imaginative reverie. In other words, anti-realism. So
Right.
it's funny how this is why I have such a strong resistance in the West when people think of great literature. The socially minded folks tend to think of, oh, well, we want the kitchen sink realism stories, or we need the likes of John Steinbeck, or pick your poison about people in shitty conditions over getting through the shitty conditions. Because I always was just more fond of people just willing to accept the imaginative realities around them, or at the very least saying that their internal mind space is worth documenting, right? I mean, so this is why Borges gets so exciting to me. This is why even Norman Mailer, which is all about his internal monologues in a way, the reality kind of falls away from there. But where my point is saying, it's like you could tell when someone is imposing structured aesthetics on you and saying, this is it,
Hmm.
this is all that's allowed. The mind naturally revolts against it. What's kind of concerning me now, I don't really see much revolt against it, but perhaps because it's not a revolt of saying, oh, you're making me read these multiculti books, therefore I'm going to read non-multiculti books. It feels now it's, oh, you're giving me all these multiculti books, I'm just not going to read.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that we see this in publishing. Publishing has gone downhill because they're trying to force feed the multiculti shit, and people are just not interested in it. And so they gravitate to, when I talk about publishing, I'm talking about like more serious books, or let me phrase that, books that are more serious but that can break out into the mainstream. And you see it in films also. You see this sort of like the niche film, that the under $5 million picture that wins the Oscar, but the middlebrow picture, yeah, there's nowhere to be found. I'm a great believer in the, how could I put it, the well-written middlebrow novel. Okay, the novel that used to win the Pulitzer, that used to be the big bestseller, because before the big bestseller was the Pulitzer Prize winner. Like, for instance, the Caine Mutiny. For instance, we discussed it when we talk about movies, right? The Caine Mutiny, the book by Herman Wouk, it was a middle ground, a middlebrow rather novel that did win the Pulitzer. It was a very good novel, very capable novel, and Wook would later go on. Well, he wrote like a whole bunch of books, but he went and did these two great World War II romance novels, romance history novels, Winds of War and War and Remembrance, both of which I read and I enjoyed thoroughly. It was a painless way to learn a lot of history and just be really entertained. Now, that kind of book, I don't think it won any prize at the time when it came out in 78, 80, but already you were seeing the schism that a book like that, or books like that, those two big volumes that should have won all of the accolades, they'd sort of been left behind. And the critical consensus was going to more and more airless kinds of fiction. Now, like Thomas Pynchon, like over the years, I've started to turn against him. And I think less and less of him as I get older, because I think it's more and more trivial. Because I realize as a writer that what he's doing is easy. And what Herman Wouk was doing is really hard. Because that kind of middlebrow book that is doing multiple things the way Herman Wouk is doing is very, very difficult to achieve. And yet that kind of almost free for all of Gravity's Rainbow, for instance, that you can conceivably write when you're stoned out of your mind on pot, right, and living down in Mexico. It's not hard to do. It's not hard to do at all, And so
No,
I
I think that's far too dismissive. No, I mean that's like saying anybody could paint a Jackson Pollock painting. I'm like, okay, give your kid a fucking crayon to see how if he makes a Jackson Pollock painting. He won't, and he
no,
can't.
no, 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 no. I'm not saying that
I
any
mean,
kid. No, no, hang on. You're not hearing what I'm saying. As a writer, because look, I can tell. Let me rephrase this. A painter, let's look at a forger. A forger is going to have a much easier time forging a Jackson Pollock than, say, Monet. It'll just be easier to do the Jackson Pollock because there's just less craft. It's interesting on many levels, but if you look at it from the point of view of a forger, in terms of being able to execute it, the Monet is vastly more difficult. And so you could say, oh, well, you're talking about craft. Well, yeah, but all art stems from craft. That's the basis.
Yeah, but I just fundamentally disagree with this notion that somehow Thomas Pynchon is just random and thus without thought. I mean, that's just a lazy effort to read him.
Well,
fundamentally,
I mean, I read him all except. Well, let me rephrase it. At Mason and Dixon, I tuned out. I just started reading and just got bored, and I say, life's too short, and I got other more interesting things to do, and just dropped him. The Mason and Dixon was the last book I read. It's pretty funny because the first book of his I read was Vineland, because it was the book that came out in '91. And, he'd been this silent figure for so long. And so I read Vineland because a friend of mine had a copy of it. I was, again, living in Chile. And I read it, and I was like, this is a weird cartoon book. I really like it. And then I got into, in order, I read Gravity's Rainbow, then Crying of Lot 49, V, and then I went back to Gravity's Rainbow, sort of like to see the evolution. And along the way, I got Slow Learner, the collection of short stories that had been written really before the start of his career. And,
they were juvenilia.
Yeah, juvenilia, right. And so my thinking was that at the time I was really wow, this is so cool, this is so cool, this is so cool, right? And then later, years later, when I started being a professional writer, getting paid to write, at one point I started working on a project in Spanish. That was sort of like a Thomas Pynchon ripoff. I was taking a lot of the ideas of Thomas Pynchon and applying them to Spanish because I could afford to do that because in Spanish you're never going to make any money as a writer unless you're very, very lucky and manage to break out in translation, right? And I was earning a living as a writer in English. And so I started writing this thing in Spanish just for kicks, a project called TKG, and which in Spanish it's a joke, TKG. But it doesn't matter. But the point is, I started writing it, and I found it so incredibly easy. And I accumulated pages and pages of this bullshit. And I started realizing that what I thought was so clever, stylistically and thematically and all the rest of it, when actually trying to copy it, as I was basically doing, I realized it was just bullshit. It was just easy. It just seemed to the uninitiated or the person who didn't have... who wasn't doing the job, it just seemed complicated or extraordinarily sophisticated to somebody who didn't write. But to an actual writer, it was trivial. And that's what I realized.
I think you've made the fallacy of saying because you've did a superficial reproduction that somehow you reproduced the mentality or the effort that went into it. I just fundamentally disagree. I don't think that you can represent completely the mindset recreation of what was going on other than at the superficial level.
No, I disagree. I disagree. As both playing music and writing, I can tell you that when you try to, like as a musician, when you start to try to cover somebody else, right, you start to understand their thought process really well. Jesus. Talk about ungrammatical. It was surprising I got paid for writing, but no, seriously, when you start, like, you take your guitar and you start trying to do Eruption, right, the famous Eddie Van Halen solo, right? Now, Eruption, you start to do it. You hear it the first time and you're like, wow, that's so fast and all the rest of it. But then you start to actually practice it and try to copy it, right? And as you start to copy it, you start to realize, like in my own case, and when I was growing up with a lot of my little friends, right, it was with eruption that we understood the structure of a fugue, because that's what he's actually doing. And it was because of eruption that I started getting into Bach, Johann Sebastian, as opposed to John Christian. And I started realizing what Eddie Van Halen was doing. And as I tried to copy his playing, I started realizing that eruption, spectacular and flashy though it is far, far more than that, okay? Because a lot of times, by the effort of copying something, by the effort of mimicking it, you start to realize the internal mechanics of it, which is what happened when I tried to do eruption on guitar, right? But when I tried to do Gravity's Rainbow in Spanish, it's sort of like a cover, I started realizing it's bullshit. See?
Well, no, I don't think that's universally true. I mean, I'll to give you another example of replicas that you can go after. Think of the original, furniture like from the Eames.
Yeah, sure.
All of the furniture they built from the inside out because they had the structure of the function that they wanted, and they built around that.
Right.
You can get replicas of an Eames aluminum group chair that is a joke. They have they have the rivets in it that hold together the leather that you're sitting on, but they're ornamental. They're not holding anything.
Yeah.
You have the bars, everything. You're building it the inside out. You've completely lost the substance, and your only function is to get money out of a naive person's checkbook.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's frankly, you're ignoring the degree to which replicas that people do tend to do that.
No. You're missing the point of what I'm trying to say insofar as
no, I know your point, but I'm just saying it's not the universal point.
Well, I'm telling you, insofar as writing, it is. Insofar as writing and trying to mimic somebody's style and mimic what they're doing because you like the effects that they're creating, you come to a far deeper understanding as to what they're actually doing.
I think that can only be true on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, well, in my case, when I started trying to replicate Thomas Pynchon, all of a sudden I realized how fundamentally simple and vacuous what he was doing. And that's why I realized several things because of this. I realized, number one, that a lot of critics today, especially the important critics like Alan Bloom, they're not writers. And they don't care about entertaining people, And I think that that's one of the great problems with literature, that it does not want to entertain people. It wants to speak to some, sealed off elite who might be entertained, but it's not the majority of people, okay?
There is no monolithic function by which we are entertained. We are not monolithically entertained the exact same way. There would only be one book if that were the
of course.
case.
You're obviously right. And I'm not disputing that. But what I am saying is that so much of literature has become airless and vacuous, and what they are doing to people who are sophisticated, it seems complicated. But if you actually know how to do this thing, it's easy. It's not difficult at all. And it's actually vacuous and pathetic, but it's being held up as being quote unquote brilliant when it's not. I mean, I'm telling you. I'm not trying to shit on Pynchon per se. I'm not trying to rain on anybody's parade. I used to be a big fan of the guy.
I think you actually are trying to shit on Pynchon. I think that's the net effect, and I just don't see it. I mean, I don't buy it.
He is a trivial writer.
If you want to argue that, yes, a lot of contemporary literature is fairly dull, I would say yes, but I would find a different cause for that. I think there is no effort to really depict anything above and beyond the self. I think almost all literature now tends to be very solipsistic. Now, you can be technically proficient in your solipsism, but, that's still solipsistic. I don't think Thomas Pynchon is solipsistic in any stretch of the term. I actually think he's doing a collage of a variety of things he's encountering and trying to come to make sense of that. And I certainly appreciate what's going on there. I mean, you may find it, easy to be a simulacra of it, but I'm pretty sure I can tell the difference between your simulacra and Thomas Pynchon in 5 seconds.
Oh yeah, I'm not doubting that. I'm not doubting that at all. Just as if I tried to play, Eddie Van Halen's Eruption, you'd be able to spot the real Eddie from the ersatz Eddie in about 2 seconds, right? 2 notes. You wouldn't need more than that. But that's not the point I'm trying to make. Okay, I'm not trying to make that the point that the copyist, can be distinguished from the real thing. No. What I'm saying is that, see, every artist goes through a phase of copying other artists. It's just a natural progression. You come to some writer, you come to some writing, and you're like, man, I want to be like that guy. I want to be able to do what he's doing. Okay. Sometimes out of envy, sometimes out of exasperation that you want to almost respond to him, like response videos, right? And so you're reacting to somebody else, either in admiration or rejection. Either way, it doesn't matter. Like in my own case, I started writing. Well, let's not get into my own case, but the point I'm trying to make is that, see, when you try to do what somebody else is doing, what somebody else has done, like let's take the non-controversial example of Eddie Van Halen's Eruption. Now, you take my word for it if you don't know it, audience, and you, Benway, that Eruption is considered like the one of the great guitar solos of all time. Okay, if not the greatest. And there are a lot of people who think that Eruption is sort of like, the pinnacle, and everything else is measured by that standard. Okay, so I started trying to play it. I never successfully played it. I started trying to play it, I don't know, in 83, I think, 84 maybe. And I practiced diligently in the whole thing. And with my little clique of friends who were all into guitar nerds, right, we tried practicing it and the whole thing, right? And we'd lower the action on our guitar to be able to move our fingers fast enough. And we did all kinds of stuff in order to copy Eddie, right? And as we tried to copy him, we learned things along the way, and we started to see what he was actually doing and started to realize that we were perceiving a certain effect. But as we sort of like tried to copy that effect, and because we were trying to copy that guitar solo, play that guitar solo, we started to realize that what he was actually doing was either much more sophisticated than we realized, or came from a background that was much more sophisticated. Now, to give a very simple example, there's this hammer-on push-off technique that Eddie Van Halen was doing, right? That in order to do it properly, okay, the timing of it, and the notes that are being played, it just naturally creates a fugue. And you start to realize that, oh, that's what's happening here. And that fugue, how can I put it? I'm not explaining myself very well, but...
Well, here's where I think the difference is, and what I think the fault in the argument from my perspective is.
Okay.
You are focused exclusively on technique, and that is insufficient. You're trying. What you're effectively saying is, because I can reproduce, or at least come to a simulacra of the technique of A, that A could be Thomas Pynchon. What you're trying to reach a point is to say, because I've reproduced the technique, I've created a situation where A is close enough to A. I've reproduced it, therefore I've learned something. Well, first off, I would say it's never truly A. You come close to it. You are sufficiently it's A-like to A, and that's just not true.
I'm not arguing
that. But in addition to that, there is more to the creation. No, let me finish. Sorry, I'll let you finish. You got to let me finish. In addition to that, there is more to A than the technique. The technique only gets you so far. And the technique in learning that tells you more about what you can do with the techniques more than what others can do with the techniques. No. And when you are dealing with Thomas Pynchon or anyone else, like, there is the technique, but there is also the Thomas Pynchon behind it who is writing. And his writing and the usage of the techniques is what you have to judge, not just, I can learn, I know the tactics of what he's doing. Yeah, you're learning a little bit about the tactics, but that's not all that's kind of going into the matter. It's also Thomas Pynchon is fucking writing it.
Yeah, look, okay, first of all, you were strawmanning me on the first part of your argument, okay?
No, I wasn't.
Yeah, because you're saying that I'm trying to create pass a fast one on people by creating an ersatz version. No, what I'm saying is that by trying to mimic somebody, imperfectly though you will, you learn more about what they are doing. That's the first part of my argument, okay? And I think that that's pretty easily defensible, okay? Are we agreed on that? That when you try to mimic somebody...
We're agreed on that, but then you've made it... You would then jump to make a judgment.
Okay, yeah, but you agree on that preliminary aspect of my argument, right? That when you try
I agree on that, yes.
Yes. I mean, it's obvious, okay? You listen to some random solo playing on the radio, and you're like, oh, whatever. Some guy who's sitting there for like 12 hours trying to copy it, he's going to know it, boatloads better than a casual listener. That's fairly obvious, and will, by the virtue of having spent 12 hours listening to it and trying to mimic it or replicate it, he will have understood what the original artist was doing in a much better way than a casual listener. That's a fair assessment, isn't it?
Yes. Now take it to the next step, which is the source of what I was arguing.
Okay, the next step is, of course, that sometimes you study something deep enough, and by way of trying to mimic it, you start to realize what's actually going on, and you start to realize that it's vacuous.
No, that's where I disagree with you, because you've made too much of a jump. You've said, because I know the technique, I can therefore have enough to make a judgment call. And I say, no, au contraire, mon frère. You have just judged some of the technique that's going on, but that is insufficient sum total of what you have experienced. You've experienced technique plus application of said technique by said individual writing it. There is more than just technique at play. And your argument, if because you mentioned nothing else, one would have to assume that because technique is what you were mentioning, that is sufficient to make a judgment call. And I say, no, that is insufficient. It's partially, you can make something out of it, but not entirely telling you the whole story.
Okay, let's look at this. Remember Marcel Duchamp? How do you pronounce his name? Duchamp?
Duchamp.
Okay, because I never learned French, even though I tried, sadly enough. Okay, so the urinal, right? The fountain. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We agree that that's a work of art, allegedly, right?
It's operating in the artistic space, yes.
Yeah, it's okay. That's very hedgy. Okay, now
no, you have to. You're going to explain what you're going to say, and I'm going to explain my response. But I'm conceding what I'm willing to concede at this point.
Okay, fine. Now, one could argue that that it's, how could I put it? Once you realize what Duchamp is doing, then you realize it's vacuous and trivial. Now, wouldn't you agree? He's just putting everyday objects.
No, so before we get, because you're asking me my thoughts, so I'm going to make the best case for the side that's going to defend Duchamp. The question of is Duchamp's urinal art, it begs the question, what is he trying to do? In theory, what he's trying to do is communicate something. I mean, I think that's generally fair. What he's trying to communicate through the found art is a position on what actually represents or constitutes your perception, or what constitutes your artistic judgment. Is art representation? Is art matter of function? Is art matter of item plus context?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what he's trying to articulate, and it's an intellectual subject that he's doing. And then the question just simply becomes, is his intellectual thesis, by taking this urinal and putting it in a artistic context, is it something worth discussing? Because everybody argues about it, I would say yes, he has created something worth discussing. The question is whether it's an art object, and for my money, it's TBD on that point. But it's not something that's easily dismissed as trivial.
Okay, so the subsequent iterations of this style, it's basically replicating the same point, wouldn't it?
He does it differently. For example, his mustache on the Mona Lisa is a different thing. And then it's like, well, what is art on top of art, right? Because that's something you will get in pop art, like what's his face? Who's the one who did the comic book stuff? You know who I'm talking about. If you don't know by name, I'm trying to remember the name. Oh God, I can't. I'm embarrassed that I've forgotten his name. He was the one who would take comic book.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, and Pow. I remember. Yeah, the famous. Yeah. Oh yeah, his name is slipping my mind, but yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yeah,
it's embarrassing that I don't know his name. Commenters hopefully can remind me.
Yeah, no, and I'm having the same mental.
But that's also a question. There is a similar thing. He's like, I'm going to take something that is craft. Comic book is craft. If anybody who tries to draw a comic book will tell you so, but generally considered low, and I put it in a artistic, highbrow context. I tweak a little bit of it. Now I'm forcing you to to see it as an art object. Is that different? I think it's similar story going on to the urinal, but it's a different question. But the thing is, and this is what we have to keep in mind for a lot of pop art, contemporary art, is that these are intellectual, philosophical questions that are being debated through art objects. And it is missing a visceral response to the art. Well, I won't even say that, because people do have a visceral response.
Yeah, contempt
to these things. Contempt in some kind, but others are fascinated by it. Who is right and who is wrong?
Well, the argument is being had.
The argument is the fact that this is why I, as much as I will make fun of contemporary art, particularly the Dean Koonzes of the world, because I think they're just trying to make money.
Hmm.
What I will have to admit with a lot of modern art that people in our traditional sense won't do is that it actually is functioning in the way that people had intended it to do so. They're actually causing you to have an argument about what is and isn't an artistic object. So to me, it's still intellectually interesting, but it's an intellectual exercise primarily in a way that the more traditional arts were only in part. Their primary function was a more emotional or visceral experience in a sort of adoration kind of way. And I think this is actually related to what we were talking about. It's not surprising to me that you started getting into adult literature through the midbrow entertainment works, and your mindset comes from there. My entry into literature was more in the the high literary style into the modernist period, which is a different perspective.
Well, and then
So,
let me just throw a curveball into that your thinking of where I'm at. Okay, you see, what happened was that as I got into more serious art, serious literature rather, the Pynchons, the DeLillos, and all the rest of it, and just gobbling up all that stuff. Yes, and I read House of Leaves back when it came out, and I have a first edition of it, as a matter of fact, or well, what as closest to a first edition as it can be, a first edition mainstream edition of it, right? As I got into all of that stuff, and I got into Borges, and I got into a lot of Pomo stuff, and I read or skimmed through Infinite Jest and all the rest of it. I got to a point in my late 20s, early 30s, where I was contemptuous of middlebrow writing. And just all, just a total, theory weenie into that kind of shit. Okay, I was into that. I was embarrassed to say that I admired, Herman Wouk, for instance. I was embarrassed by the fact that I'd enjoyed his book so much. And I had gotten to that point around like 29, between 29 and 35. No, less, younger. Between 29 and 33, I would say, because 2001 was a big year, and I'll explain why. See, I was into that, and I was very dismissive of middlebrow writing, and it was actually a very bad thing for me, because professionally speaking, because I was actually earning a living as a middlebrow writer, and yet I found contempt for it, and I didn't want to do it because I was sort of ashamed. Okay, and it was a sort of like an awkward position for me. Between this dichotomy between how I was earning a living and what I admired and respected, right? And what happened was that after 33, I just went into different fields insofar as earning my living, okay? And I left writing behind as a living, okay? I started getting into film production and whatnot, and then into venture capital, and then just, life I just went into different directions. And so writing and literature and the whole thing sort of like was just left by the wayside, or not by the wayside, but just left behind. A chapter that, in a previous, pages of my life. And I just kept on writing along in the book of my life into different chapters and different things and different interests, right? I had a period of getting into architecture, heavily into architecture, into painting and what have you. And then, I started rethinking, reevaluating a lot of things that I'd learned about literature. Stuff like a lot of the stuff that Harold Bloom had said. And I remember very clearly that the book that for me was the cleavage point was this guy Harold Brodsky's Stories in an Almost Classical Mode. For me, that was a very, very important book in my development because, see, that's like the what guys like Harold Bloom thought was just like true art and, the great classic and blah, blah, blah. And I read it and I thought it was just bullshit. And as a professional writer, I started looking at it and paying attention to it and started realizing how easy it was. And I started to realize that a lot of my highfalutin over-intellectualization of books and my going after and pretending to enjoy a lot of postmodern shit was just sort of like social signaling. It was me showing that I was like, clever. And I realized a lot of other people of my class and background and upbringing were reading these books that we didn't really enjoy, but we thought that everybody else was, and so we had to do it too. And this is, everybody laughs about it now, but when Infinite Jest came out, everybody had a copy of it and nobody read it, and you could tell because the spines weren't broken. They sort of like flip it open in the subway and sort of like pretend to read it, but they weren't actually reading it because it's so goddamn dull. It was just so goddamn dull and stupid. And there was an example of somebody that I realized retrospectively was copying Thomas Pynchon and trying to elicit the same effect, and it was just vacuous. It was just pages of pages that went nowhere, and that weren't interesting. And so what happened to me was it was sort of like I reached an apex of being into airless fiction. And then I started going down that hill and started realizing, what the fuck was I doing? And I started consciously realizing that some of the more middlebrow stuff was much better, much more real. I mean, there is a reason that Raymond Chandler and we just called him the Maltese Falcon guy, and all these Dashiell Hammett and all these noir writers, they are respected today. There's a reason H.P. Lovecraft is respected today and is considered an artist. Okay, there's a reason that a lot of these writers that are pulpier or middlebrow, or call them what you will, they spoke of more profound things. And a lot of this very highfalutin, airless fiction, this very clever fiction, the Duchamps of the literary world, well, they're full of shit. Yeah, it makes you think about stuff, but it's just full of shit.
Well, I'll tell you what I fundamentally don't like.
Okay.
Here's the thing. What I fundamentally don't like is categorical judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But what I mean by that, yes, I would say at a certain point in your life, you tend to want to like things that are approved. And those approved things could be approved from any number of reading value areas. Could be either popularity from the reading public, or it could be critical consensus. Anytime someone categorically says these books can only be good, these types of books can only be bad, I get irritated and I want to go away. It's essentially the Soviet, socialist realism imposing itself. So yes, of course, categorically, I won't say I can only read, the pomo fiction. I would never say that, nor would I ever want to. In fact, when someone imposes that, I want to run away.
Yeah.
But at the same token, when I hear someone in kind of negative response to that say, all of these guys were full of shit. They were vapid, or there was too much smoke up their own ass. Well, that's to me more of an attitude towards the critical consensus, as opposed to the books in of themselves. I will always just take the work on its own merit, which is why I will not categorically say comic books are trivial.
Yeah,
I will not categorically say, like popular fiction is dull. I will attack Harry Potter, but because I've read it and I'm very specific, I don't like its repetitiveness and its derivativeness.
Yeah.
But that's a specific critique of Harry Potter. It's not, that all books published by Scholastic are inherently bad. That's just not so.
I completely agree with your assessment. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why when I hear someone say like, I grew out of this because they were trivial. I'm like, well, you can grow out of a certain book. I get that. But to just suddenly say like, there's nothing worth reading in postmodernism, I will never go there, nor will I ever encourage that thinking. And, my hesitation, to some of the, kind of comments we were making today is in that vein. I think there is like a reaction which feels more towards the society that demanded that we read certain books as opposed to others, which I'm responding to more so than the books themselves. I wouldn't blame Thomas Pynchon and William Gaddis, for saying, you're the reason there's a postmodern consensus and why we have to read you. They just wrote their goddamn books. Take them on their own terms is kind of the attitude I have. And I, just hesitate to do the broad brushstrokes, because I was like that younger. When you're prone to be they popular opinion or critical opinion, you feel the need to justify what you're doing. You get embarrassed by what you read. Like you said, you were embarrassed by reading The Caine Mutiny. You shouldn't have been embarrassed for liking The Caine Mutiny. There was no reason for that. But I think for a lot of people, they feel that way because they're in a point in their life where their confidence isn't really there, right? I mean, part of what builds your confidence is like, well, other people agree with me. That's maybe I'm not wrong. Eventually, you get to a point where you say, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm not reading these books in public. I do have my coterie of like people who I have shared interests with, but I've gotten confident enough to where, I know we have a lot of shared opinions on things, shared, consensus on a number of books, but he'll read certain books that I don't like. I'll read books that he doesn't like. Expand your, beyond books and
Well, like you
to
and I.
films, and yeah, we have actually a lot of books I think we read that we like in common, but there's certain things we don't. I mean, I think this episode kind of discusses some of that. But that's kind of the attitude that I think ideal state you want to get into, which is confident enough to accept your judgment on its own terms, but also confident enough to know that when someone criticizes it, it's not the end of the world either.
Yeah, no, look, here's the thing. Like I said, the disappointment level that I have with Pynchon is vast, okay? Because we're talking about a specific writer. And see, at the time I read him, and I thought he was a big deal. And what happened also was that I read a lot of Pomo stuff in college, especially, that I thought was just like far from the mark, or just like, subpar. And I was very critical of that. And by the way, when I was in college in the early 90s, already we had this thing of basically identity politics in literature and the books that you were supposed to read, and that they were supposed to, fill up certain buckets of societal buckets, the black writer, the veteran writer, the woman writer, this,
Right.
that. And yeah, we're talking about Wuthering Heights, which I actually got a new copy of it. I'm going to reread it. I haven't read it in years. And that's a great book. It is a great book. It doesn't matter that it was Emily Brunt who wrote it and she's a woman. No. It was just objectively a great book. And in college, I saw in the 90s, I noticed two things that were going on. Number one, they were handing out the reading list based on exterior criteria as opposed to it actually mattering. And number two,
Right.
all the professors were bullshitting. They were just
Yeah.
bullshitting the whole hour. And I wasn't learning anything. I mean, when I went to college, I originally decided that I was going to get a dual major in philosophy and English. I took like one English class. It was on The Birth of the Novel, I think it was called, by this tenured professor at Dartmouth. This was 91. And she was a fucking idiot. She was just bullshitting her way. And there was no historical context or no, why is this book more important than the other? No, it was just like, oh, she's just like talking about like feminism and all kinds of crap. It was like Moll Flanders, right? And
Right.
she was talking about Moll Flanders and like feminist heroine and whatever. What the fuck was she talking about? Why was this being read? Why was this book important at the time? And therefore, why should we care about it now? Okay, because there are books that are important in their time, that trigger a lot of things to happen subsequently. And there are books, of course, that are important at their time and sort of like die and are forgotten. You look at the bestseller list and you can tell right away that there are some books that just, there are books that you're like, what the fuck book was this? I never even heard of it, right? And there was no, it was like a mule, a mule is sterile, okay? It wasn't a stallion that begat, thousands of foals, right? And that's the way of literature. That's the way of all art, and it's no big deal. But the point I'm trying to make is that I remember thinking in that class, they're bullshitting me. And that's why I sort of like turned away from the whole English establishment, because I just paid attention to my own opinion. My own opinion had served me well when I'd been an autodidact before I went to college. And then when I got to college and I realized everybody was just bullshitting, I figured, why mess with the good thing? It works when I just read whatever I want and have my own opinions about it. And so that was my evolution. And I think that the fact that I rejected the elite opinion is when I had the opportunity to, because when I said that I admired Pomo writers, I did, but it was sort of like I admired them and I thought that is what I should strive for. But I didn't realize that the very top echelons of that kind of airless fiction, like the Thomas Pynchon, because in my mind, Pynchon was like the epitome of the truly sophisticated, as opposed to the ersatz sophisticated. Because I always thought that David Foster Wallace was just, like you were saying before, what we were criticizing, that he was just copying the technique, but didn't have the quote unquote soul of Pynchon. Okay.
Yes.
That's that criticism that you were making. Yeah, I'd apply it to David Foster Wallace, as I think that you would too. But my
For that book in particular, yeah.
I haven't read his other fiction. I haven't read his
So
nonfiction.
this is the reason I brought up that book in particular, because this is also has happened to me. You had mentioned the critical consensus, and in rejecting it. For me, I rejected the authority.
Yeah.
of the critical consensus, less so what they had to say. Some of them, yes, I did, but other guys actually, because like there was a series I saw of lectures online, and this happens a lot. It's related to how I said I find and read other books. One of the critics I do like is James Wood, not James
Yeah,
Woods,
yeah, yeah.
the
James
actor.
Wood,
There's
yeah, the New
James
Yorker
Wood,
writer,
the New Yorker critic. I don't know if he still writes there,
and a
but
very good drummer, by the way. At
he
least,
is. There's a video of him online finger
yeah, he's
drumming.
very good.
Um, yeah, he did not like David Foster Wallace. He made it very clear in his work. But after David Foster Wallace died, he was put on to reading David Foster Wallace's collection of short stories, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men.
Mhm.
And he talked about it in a series that I wish I could find more episodes of it, but I think the concept of the series was talk about a book you liked from an author you hated, or something you read that reassessed your critical consensus.
Right?
And he said, I did not like David Foster Wallace, but was recommended this book, and he died, and so I felt, well, maybe I'll give him an extra shot. And he said he actually felt that there was value to this particular book because it is not like the infinite jest of 400,000 pages with 50,000 footnotes. It was just short stories that just packed a punch to them. And he read them and gave reasons why. And I would not have read that book were it not for, this, critic saying, for me, it was worth it. And let me tell you why. So that kind of dialogue is necessary for me in order to make sure I continue to be exposed to things that I ordinarily might have been recalcitrant to. And that's what I said. Like, I rejected the critical authority without necessarily saying I rejected the critics outright. You know what I mean? I'm still engaging with them in some capacity. And I think that's why, even though I think that autodidacticism is important, I don't treat it in the absolute terms of only my opinion, fuck all. Right?
Yeah.
And so I still need to engage with people I disagree with because I think I'm going to get more out of it. I just don't feel that
Well, you
what
have.
needs to be rejected is the idea that they just simply whatever they said must be followed. That's not.
Well, my thinking about the autodidacticism is that, first of all, most of everything in life that you have to deal with is, you're self-taught in just about every trade or craft that you wind up doing, no matter how sophisticated. Even things like being a doctor, where you think it's all very highly structured and there's always a mentor. There's lots of space where you just have to sort of like make it up as you go along and figure it out on your own. So autodidactism as just a term, I think it's sort of like or self-taught. I think it's used a lot of times by people who have credentials or have a certain authority and they want to protect it. They want to protect the value of their credential. They want to protect their position as an authority. And I think it's a shitty way of dismissing somebody. And to give you an example, a trivial example, I remember one time I was talking to somebody who was very into credentials, right, and authority and that kind of thing. And I was talking to him about this guitar player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers, John Frusciante, right? John Frusciante is just a fucking god of the guitar, right? And he can do no wrong as far as I'm concerned. It's not that I like everything that he does. Sometimes I think it's kind of boring, but that's not the point. The point is the guy is just a fucking genius, right? And this person was telling me, I was telling him about John Frusciante, and this kind of person was, well, who taught him? Or he was like, nobody, he just figured it out on his own. Oh, so he's like a self-taught guitar player. So he's not like, it was almost like the impression of like, oh, so he doesn't really know much about the guitar. And anybody who knows John Frusciante knows that the motherfucker, when he was like between the ages of like 14 and probably today, he spends like, 18 hours a day playing guitar. The guy is just a monster guitar player, sort of like Buckethead. Buckethead is just weird as fuck, but he practices. And when you get to that level of practice, of honing your craft, learning your craft that well, you transcend your craft. You just go beyond it. And the work of Buckethead, the work of John Frusciante is an example of that, right? So my thing of whenever anybody talks about being self-taught, I hate that term or even hints at it because I always feel that it is subtly dismissive. And I got the credential. I got a minor in English because I had enough credits to get a minor in English at Dartmouth. I double majored in history and philosophy, and and wrote about Russian history and did a lot of work and prepared a seminar on Hegel's philosophy of right. But bottom line, I got the credentials. And so I realized that it's just full of shit. It's emperor new clothes. And I feel that so much of 20th century art is emperor's new clothes. And I think it's because, frankly, the entertainments of our society has made it so that there's a class of people who constantly want to feel superior to others by way of their knowledge of some art or some non-essential thing. And they lack the money to distance themselves from the hoi polloi by way of money and a big house and a big entourage. And so they find this distancing themselves from the hoi polloi by way of knowledge, by way of artistic knowledge. And I find that kind of low, to tell you the truth. And I think that that's why 20th century art has been just so, and I talk about all forms practically. 20th century and 21st century art has just been so barren, and so little of it has been of any merit, any long-term merit, any value, any civilizational value. You see what I'm saying? I think that's the problem.
I think I'm a slightly different mindset. But here, what I'll meet you with is, of course, people are using the credentialed aspect of things and a consensus to justify an opinion above and beyond the merit that it would be worth on its own set. That I can't deny. What I will challenge, though, is how we, if you take the opposite position, just uncritically the opposite position, you veer very close, if not directly into the center of this notion of the atomized libertarian view of the world, which is I'm an individual alone, responsible for everything about me. That's solipsistic too. I mean, that just, and it isn't true. There is something to be said of there is engagement with the world of the society that you share, that you're a part of, and that's how you learn. Yes, I think you need to be in a position where you own that engagement in a, what's the word I'm looking for, mindful kind of way. Like you become responsible for your opinions and justifying them. But you can't say that at the same time it's like this critical consensus is the sole reason we are where we are. I think the other reason we are where we are is that if anything, we have taken the extreme individual view to judgment to the point now where everything is valuable, and like the standard of judgment, like we're saying in literature, is it's not the technique which can be judged by critical standards we share. No, the standards are now I'm a black woman who's writing. That's rare. Give me credit.
Yeah.
I'm an individual. I mean, I could be completely oblivious to how to write a book, and I'm just writing whatever. I'm just writing whatever words come to mind. And give me a medal. So both
they get
poles,
it. They get it.
Sometimes they get it right. So my where's my attitude? I'm almost becoming like a Greek in their ethics, which is to say, the healthy median. Right, the healthy medium between the two extremes, which isn't necessarily like the exact middle between them. That's the misreading people generally have of Aristotelian ethics. No, the Greek ethics is simply there are two incomplete notions of the world in contradiction to each other, but taken in their full lead to that incompleteness, that falseness. You have to have some element of both, and you work and manage through that. And I think that's kind of where we're at now. It's like, yes, you can't, it's blind consensus to the credentials for the sake of supporting yourself leaves you kind of hollow and distant from, the work you're reading. But at the same time, pure individual atomization just, reinforces your solipsism and your isolation from the community. So there's a kind of balancing act that needs to be had there.
Yes. And so on that note, I've just realized the time. We've gone on past an hour and a half. And I think that we've tried the patience of our dear listeners. But this has been a really fun conversation. I wish we could go on further. Or what we'll probably do is just stop now and keep on going. So anyway, to our dear listeners, this has been the Coach and Benway podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation that went all over the place. But it's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be about going all over the place. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Benway, will, as always, leave us with a final thought, a deep thought. Doctor, what is your deep thought for this week, for this episode?
Well, the silly answer is plastics, but the legitimate the legitimate answer is you may have thought that this was all over the place, but what Coach and I just did was effectively reproduce the conversation and arguments I was having with my best friend when we started really getting into literature. So what you saw right now was the dynamic that happened that caused me to read more. And I encourage you to find someone whom which you could have this level of conversation.
Yeah.
And by sheer accident, you will start reading more.
Yeah.
I guarantee it.
Yeah, because two things happen in this conversation to me is that, first of all, there's an energized desire to read a bunch of stuff, more stuff, and to, show Benway that he's wrong, as always, of course. But the thing is, see, it's so much fun, and this, we don't allow enough of it. At different points in this conversation, I think, Benway, it would be safe to say that both of us got a little heated at different points in the conversation, right? That's a wonderful thing, because we have a genuine argument and disagreement, and we think at that moment that the other is full of shit, but stepping back, of course, there's a fundamental respect for one another. And I think that is sorely lacking, to add to your final point, and sorry for sort of like spoiling on it or having the last word, but that notion of disagreement is where true friendship arises from and true knowledge arises from. Because if it's a disagreement based on actual respect for the other person's point of view, and a disagreement that is forcefully presented and forcefully defended, but at the same time with care that the relationship itself is the valuable thing, well, I think that we got something, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, I've had a good time in this conversation. I hope you have too. So dear listeners, take it easy, and we will see you in the next episode.
So for the actual last word, plastics.